Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With South Africa accepting it's in the fifth wave of COVID, fueled by the Omicron subvariants BA.4 and BA.5, which recently were recognized by Europe as variants of concern, we ask, what are the implications for the rest of the world? Joining me to answer that question is someone perhaps who is best qualified to answer it, Professor of Global Health both at the University of Columbia in the United States, as well as the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, Professor Salim Abdool Karim. Professor Abdool Karim, in a paper you released last week on Monday, you said, and I'm quoting you, "I was hoping that I would not have to convey this news. South Africa is in its fifth wave." Briefly, what are the facts that lead you to this conclusion? And is the wave growing, or is it now showing signs of peaking?
Yes, a very good day to you, Karen, and to all of your viewers. We have had, since the beginning of this pandemic, 4 waves, and in between each of those waves, we've had a pretty consistent period of about 3 months of low transmission. So much so that we can roughly predict when the next wave is coming. And so when you do a simple calculation, which I did in February, we predicted that the fifth wave would arrive in South Africa and be declared on the 8th of May. And if we look at the criteria we use, that is related to the number of cases, the proportion of cases in the population, the positivity rate, South Africa crossed that mark in the first week of May. And that essentially means we are in the fifth wave. The cases have been rising steadily. It hasn't been a runaway wave like we saw with the original Omicron BA.1 or with its successor BA.2. Instead, this wave has grown at a slower pace, and I think probably related to the amount of immunity within the community. So at this stage, we are well and truly in the fifth wave, and cases are still continuing to rise.
One of the things I noticed from Worldometers is that 3 or 4 days ago, your cases were rising at something like 8,015, 8,300 a day. But suddenly in the last couple of days, the rate of increase has almost halved. Is that because the last 2 days were weekends and therefore the testing goes down and the cases go down?
You are spot on, Karen. So we have the situation where in the weekends on Saturday and Sunday, the number of tests decline and the number of positive cases identified decline. That has been the case in South Africa and in fact in many other countries across the world right from the beginning of the epidemic. So we always have declines in the weekend. So that's why it's much better to quote a 7-day moving average so that you iron out these weekend fluctuations. And if you look at the 7-day moving average, as of yesterday, that was 7,600 cases. But in between, we've had days with over 10,000 cases. So it has been fluctuating a bit. But if you iron it out, we are now at a level where we exceed 10 cases per 100,000 population per day, which is a level that we would regard well and truly a high transmission rate.
Now, is this wave caused mainly by the BA.4, BA.5 subvariants of Omicron? And if the answer is yes, does that mean that both the variant and the subvariant have become potential causes of future new waves of infection?
Yeah, so we've become used to the idea that the virus has to create a new variant in order to cause a wave. And the reason for that has been very elementary, in that every time there is a wave of a variant, the amount of immunity it leads to in those who've become infected is quite good and is quite high, so that you can't get reinfected with the same variant. So the original variants of alpha, beta, gamma, delta, those original variants, we have good immunity to them because they've already been through the population. So we've been expecting that that the virus would cause new waves with a new variant. So it was quite surprising to see that it is not a new variant, but a subvariant that is causing South Africa's fifth wave. Now, that's quite significant. It's significant because the virus is indicating to us that it doesn't have to only create new variants, also its subvariants can cause waves. So now we got two things to worry about. It was bad enough when we had one thing to worry about. We now have two. It is a bit unique to Omicron. So for example, Delta variants, there were over 150 subvariants of Delta. You may recall AY42, for example, caused a bit of a scare. But none of the Delta subvariants became a problem because if you had immunity to the original Delta, you had good immunity to any of its subvariants. With Omicron, because Omicron has over 50 mutations, even its subvariants are substantially different from the original BA.1. Now, BA.4 and BA.5, they are lineages, or refer to it as they're like children or offspring of BA.2. So they come from the lineage of BA.2. But even in those who have had BA.2, BA.4 and BA.5 are able to still cause infection. So these new subvariants are behaving almost like they are new variants, even though they come from Omicron and are still considered Omicron subvariants.
In that case, given what you've just told me, let me ask you a few specific questions about BA.4 and BA.5. To begin with, do we know how much more infectious BA.4 and BA.5 are compared to BA.2 or even BA.1?
So that's a bit difficult to assess early on. So the way in which it's done, normally you wait for the transmission to occur over several weeks to get an accurate measure. We can look at the very early data, and what the early data suggests is that BA.4 and BA.5, let's just first establish, they are very similar. In fact, in the spike protein, BA.4 and BA.5 are exactly identical. They differ in 3 mutations that are outside of the spike protein. So these two subvariants are very similar. We can refer to them more or less as one subvariant. But what we are seeing is that both BA.4 and BA.5 have a slightly higher transmissibility than BA.2. So transmissibility seems to be one of its advantages. It does not seem to be a significantly different transmission rate, just slightly higher, based on a very early assessment. So that might change as we get more data. But at this point, greater transmissibility certainly seems to be there. A bigger concern is that BA.4 and BA.5 have mutations that confer immune escape. Now, what we're particularly concerned about is that on the virus itself, there is a specific part of its protein that attaches to the human cell. So the human cell has a receptor called the ACE2 receptor, and that's where the virus joins. At a particular position on the virus, we call it position 484, that's the number of the position. At 484, the virus is negatively charged. And the human cell, the ACE2 receptor, is also negatively charged. So these, at 484, the virus doesn't sit comfortably. It's continually repelling. But what happens in this particular subvariant is that there is a mutation at 484. And that mutation converts the virus from negative charge to positive charge. So that means we now have a virus that's positively charged coming and sitting on the virus which is negatively charged. So that creates a situation where the virus has better attachment to the cell, makes it harder for our antibodies to displace it and kill it. And so that's one of the things we have a concern about. And in this particular BA.4 and BA.5, they have mutations at both 484 and at 486. So that's our concern about the way in which these two new subvariants may be able to escape the existing immunity that we may have. And we already know that in individuals who are vaccinated and individuals who've had past infection, BA.4 and BA.5 are still able to cause infection, though they don't cause severe disease.
The very last words you said are good news, but the first part of that answer was actually a bit disturbing. Can I repeat it for the audience in language I've understood, and correct me if I make a terrible mistake? You're saying the two mutations, 484 and 486, means that if you have a previous infection from, say, BA.1 or BA.2 that does not confer sufficient immunity, and you are liable to catch infection again from BA.4 and BA.5. In other words, protection from earlier infection is very weak in the case of BA.4 and BA.5.
You've got it perfectly.
What about protection from vaccination? Does that continue to be as strong as it would have been in the case of BA.1 and BA.2? Or again, do these two mutations mean it's weaker in the case of BA.4 and BA.5?
So the same argument you've just outlined for natural infection also applies to vaccination. So if you take 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, and we know that with 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, we get a steady deterioration in the amount of antibodies over time. So if you take somebody who is 4 months post their second dose, the protection of 2 doses of Pfizer vaccine against BA.4 and BA.5 is quite low, in the region of 20 to 30% only. When you consider the original efficacy was 95%. So the vaccines, especially with waning immunity, have much lower protection against these 2 subvariants. But I want to make one very important point, and that protection that I'm talking about, that is diminished, is protection against mild disease. Protection against severe disease and hospitalization is intact. All of the vaccines, no matter which ones you take and how long ago you took them, the T-cell immunity that protects individuals from severe disease, that remains intact. So even though people are getting infected and get a bit of a cold, a bit of sore throat, a bit of fever, they don't get severe disease and don't need hospitalization to a very large extent. The vaccines remain effective against hospitalization and severe disease.
Quite right. It's the antibody part of the immunity that wanes, not the T-cell part of the immunity. But would that be equally true, not just of Pfizer, which is the vaccine you've used in South Africa, but also of AstraZeneca, which we in India call Covishield? Would it be equally true of that?
So we don't have data on that yet. So that's why I was quite specific about referring to the Pfizer vaccine, because that's the data we have. But I can just give you some conjecture that it really shouldn't be any different. We do have some early data from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that, similarly to the Pfizer vaccine, holds up superbly in preventing severe infection, but is not very good in preventing mild infection against these 2 subvariants. So I would expect Covishield to be fairly similar that we would expect that individuals who get these two subvariants would routinely get infected, and there would be very low protection from vaccines or natural infection, but that the vaccines would hold up quite well against severe disease.
Let me pick up on that little bit of good news which you gave us in an earlier part of your answer. And this is also in the paper you released last Monday. In the paper, you say the BA.4, the BA.5 variants are causing only a few cases of severe disease. Is that because the subvariants are less virulent, or is it because vaccines are holding up much better? Or is it both?
So I think it's actually three things that are contributing. So the first is that the Omicron variant and all its subvariants seem to have a very similar characteristic in that they are very efficient in infecting the cells that are in the nose and in the back of the throat. How much more efficient? Well, it's a lot more efficient. To give you some quantification, the Omicron variant can attach and grow in your nose, cells in your nose, about 70 times more efficiently than Delta. So that's why Omicron is so infectious that you can't keep it at bay. I mean, even China, that's trying to keep their zero COVID policy, is struggling against Omicron. They could hold Delta back, but Omicron, if one person gets infected, because there's so much of virus that grows in the nose because of its highly efficient attachment, that it's highly infectious. But the good news is that the Omicron variant is 10 times less efficient in infecting the cells of the lung. So the alveolar cells in the lung, the Omicron variant is not very good in infecting. That's why not many people who get Omicron will actually get the respiratory distress and require oxygen, as we saw, for example, with the Delta variant. So the variant itself has become less virulent, which is something that we have been expecting, because we expect viruses over time to become less virulent. So that's the first thing. The virus has changed. The second is that we have large populations now who are vaccinated, and with vaccination, the vaccines hold up pretty well, especially for severe disease. So we are seeing very few additional admissions to hospital in our fifth wave. If you look at the line, there's just a small increase in hospitalizations from COVID-19. So it really has not been much of an issue from a hospital point of view. And then finally, if you look at the natural immunity, we have, because we've got about 50% vaccine coverage, and because the BA.1 variant and Delta variant had already infected large parts of our country, we have about, over and above the 50% who've been vaccinated, we have about another 30% that are protected from natural infection. So between 25 and 30%. So natural infection is protective, that leads to less severe disease. Vaccination is protective, leading to less severe disease, and the virus itself is less virulent. So all three factors are contributing to the current observations that we have in South Africa in the fifth wave. In fact, up to last week, we had no increases in deaths from the fifth wave. So that just gives you some idea of the overall direction that we are going in with this new subvariant.
That is particularly good news. No appreciable increase in deaths during this wave. Let me ask you about what I think is a different mutation, which I've read about in the literature to do with BA.4 and BA.5. It's called the L452R mutation, which I believe is also found in Delta. Now, as you've explained, these subvariants, BA.4 and BA.5, cause only mild disease. So then does this L452R mutation, is it what's responsible for the immune escape of these two subvariants?
So you're quite right. So the 452 mutation, remember, it's just further down on the sequence from 484 and 486. So we think that 452, 486, those are the two key mutations that are conferring this additional immune escape to BA.4 and BA.5. So, I have to say it's still early days because these are, I would say, projections of what is likely to occur from these mutations. But the experiments to actually do them, where, for example, we'll do them in mice, where we put the mutation in and take the mutation out and look at what happens in mice, we don't have those data yet. So we can't comment on the basis of actual data. But based on what we think is likely to be the case, yes, 452 is going to play, in all likelihood, a role in immune escape.
Thank you very much for that. Now, there is a view, and I suppose it's particularly endorsed by those who subscribe to what's called the Barrington Declaration, that because each subvariant is more infectious than the earlier one, but at the same time, because the virulence of the disease remains mild, there's no point in trying to prevent infections, and instead we should A, learn to live with them, and B, let everyone get infected, because that will bring the infections to an end. Do you subscribe to that view, or do you think this is inherently risky?
Well, I think it's really nonsense, and it reflects a sense of fatalism. It reflects a sense of defeatism. The virus has defeated us. Let it just run wild. I have to say, that is just not a policy of how you fight a pandemic. That's not how you deal with infectious diseases. Let me explain why. There are two key reasons. The first is that we are not only looking at hospitalization and deaths in COVID-19. We now have a much clearer understanding that there are many long-term consequences of SARS-CoV-2 infection. So individuals who get infected run the risk of long COVID. In my own clinic here, about 10 to 20% of patients have this problem, and it's a debilitating condition. They talk about this brain fog. They can't concentrate. They can't read. So it's not just about going to hospital. It's about all these long-term consequences. We also now know that individuals who had COVID-19 have about a 50% increased risk of heart disease 1 year later. And that heart disease is stroke, myocardial infarction or heart attacks, and myocarditis. Now, we are going to see, a tsunami of all these conditions in 2-3 years from now, because they are the long-term consequences of SARS-CoV-2 infection. So our goal must be to avoid any additional people from getting infected. We should ideally have no one infected, but we know that that's not practical. But let's try and minimize the number of people who get infected so that we don't have to deal with this long COVID and the long-term consequences. The second is that, sorry, go ahead.
No, please carry on. I didn't mean to interrupt. My apologies.
No. So the first issue is that we are in a situation where we want to prevent not just hospitalization, but we do want to prevent infections. The second is that we are going through a period where we are using technology as our strategy to combat this pandemic. And this fatalism is sometimes misinterpreted. And that some people say, well, if you've got a vaccine, then you can, not bother about everything else. That's simply not true. We have a very good understanding now that to be effective in combating this pandemic, we need to adopt a vaccination plus strategy. So that means vaccines are our foundation, but we know there are new variants that can escape the vaccine. We know that vaccine immunity wanes. And so we take a vaccination plus. What is the plus? The plus is dependent on what is needed in your setting based on transmission, based on risk factors. So for example, in South Africa, the plus refers to 3 key strategies. We have vaccination, plus we have 3 things. The first is we control and we have restrictions on mass indoor gatherings because we are worried about super spreading events. We've already had a few, and they got the virus out of control in the past when we had the Beta variant. So we've learned that lesson. The second is in indoor settings where ventilation is not good, we insist that people mask. And the third is that we want to ensure that there's some controls at the borders so that we reduce the risk of new variants coming in. So that controls really about vaccination or a negative test in order to enter the country. So those 3 things more or less give us South Africa's vaccination plus strategy. In India, you'll have to work out what that plus would mean. But I've given you some idea of what needs to be done. So we can't throw our hands up and say, okay, we give up, virus, you win. We've got to say, no, we want to mitigate its impact. We want to move into a situation where we are winning over this virus. We understand that that's not a short-term battle, but we have to continue to chip away and try to mitigate its impact with each successive variant. And if we don't do that, then I believe we will be adopting a strategy that will lay the basis for very large numbers of people to have the long-term problems of COVID-19.
And there is, of course, one other problem which the Barrington Declaration proponents seem to ignore, which is if you let the virus rip through the population and more people get infected, the opportunity for mutation increases, and those mutations need not necessarily be milder ones. You could have a more virulent mutation, and that would be a disaster.
You're absolutely right. So there's this, people have confused our hopes and wishes with what the reality is. We hope and we wish that all future variants are going to be mild variants like Omicron or even more mild than Omicron. But we have to remember that if we take the first 4 variants of concern, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, each of those variants was more severe than the one before. Each of those variants, so Beta was worse than Alpha, Delta was worse than Gamma, and if you look at them, each successive variant caused more infections, more hospitalizations, and more deaths. So we have lived through a period where the variants were getting progressively worse. We now have the benefit of natural immunity. We have the benefit of vaccines. And so we are banking on those to keep us protected. But this virus is 30,000 base pairs long. So that means it has innumerable, in the billions, in terms of the number of mutations it can make. It hasn't even explored anywhere near its potential to lead to completely new forms of this virus. So we have to always remain vigilant and hope that it doesn't happen, but we have to prepare for an eventuality of what happens if the virus mutates and a more virulent form emerges that is able to escape our natural and vaccine immunity. That is a future we hope won't happen, but we have to be able to deal with it if it does. And so that's how we need to be thinking. And we need to decrease the possibility that it will occur. And how do you do that? Well, you minimize the number of transmissions and new infections. That's the way you do that.
In other words, you do the exact opposite of what the Barrington Declaration is suggesting. Now, you make one further point in that paper of last week, and I'll quote it. You say there is a reasonable chance that BA.4, BA.5 may cause an increase in cases globally. And then you add, if this happens, I would expect it to occur only in about 4 to 6 weeks from now. And given that you wrote this a week ago, does that mean that we won't know for another 5 weeks whether BA.4 and BA.5 will create surges and spikes across the globe?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is that the original immunity that you get to BA.2 in particular, when that immunity is high, when those antibody levels are high, they will protect against BA.4 and BA.5. But what happens is that about 3 to 4 months after you've had the wave of infection, the immunity in the population comes to a very low level. And so that's the opportunity for BA.4 and BA.5 to spread. If BA.4 and BA.5 enter the community when they still have high levels of antibodies from the original Omicron, it will have difficulty in spreading, and it will basically peter out. Now, why am I concerned about BA.1 and BA.2? Well, BA.1, the original Omicron variant, caused very large numbers of asymptomatic infections or mildly symptomatic infections, but it spread like wildfire. So a very high proportion of the population got infected. But because most of those infections were asymptomatic, the antibody levels that you get from asymptomatic infection is much lower than you get when you get severe infection. So when you've had a more symptomatic infection, the antibody levels are higher. So because most of it was asymptomatic, the antibody levels are lower. That means it disappears or wanes faster. And so 3 to 4 months later, you got very low levels of the antibodies remaining from the BA.1 infection. When you have that problem on a mass scale within the community, and into that situation enters BA.4, BA.5, they will be able to spread. So it can't come too quickly. If it comes too quickly, it won't manage to create a wave. It's got to come at the right time. So it all depends on how it's being transmitted. And we know BA.4 is in many countries already. It's just a question of whether that's going to happen. And we'll know that in about a month's time.
Professor Abdool Karim, if I've understood you correctly, what you said about the impact of BA.4, BA.5, depending upon when it comes, if it comes at the right time, when immunity levels from vaccination are waning, it can spread fairly rapidly and widely. That worries me about India in particular, and I want to put my fear to you because I'm a layman, I'm a journalist, I'm not a specialist, and correct me if I'm wrong. The audience would like to know I'm wrong, but if I'm right, please also point it out. In India, the policy is not to give a booster until 9 months have lapsed since your second jab. Most people believe the booster should be given after 4 or 5 months, not 9. But by 9 months, your immunity levels in terms of antibodies will have waned very considerably. If at that point, when you are 6, 7, 8 months away from your second jab, BA.4 and BA.5 enter the country, immunity levels will be low, they will spread very rapidly, and a lot of people could fall ill. Mercifully, it won't be seriously ill, we hope, but a lot of people will fall ill. So what your advice, I presume, would be, if what I'm saying is correct, is that the Indian government must very quickly shorten that gap and start giving boosters, not just to travelers. Travelers have been allowed to get it after 3 months, but they're an exception. Not everyone travels abroad. Now they must make clear that everyone in the country can have a booster after 4 or 5 months of the second jab and not wait for 9. Have I got that right?
Mostly. So I'm not sure about what the evidence is that the Indian government has based its policy on. But when you look at Covishield, its antibody levels that you get from Covishield are lower than what you get from an mRNA vaccine. Because it's lower, it will wane and reach lower levels after waning. That will be much lower than what you would see in an mRNA vaccine at the same time. So you would expect that with Covishield, given the levels that are attained of antibodies, and I'm only referring here to antibodies, not T cells, because T cells are pretty intact. As far as antibodies are concerned, you would expect that within about 6 months, a booster dose would be helpful. Now, I have to point out that booster doses, if you give a third dose, a third dose seems to be really important because it takes the antibody levels up to a new high. And when you get that third dose, then you are protected again for a long period. But when you give a fourth dose, as we saw in Israel in their study, but this was of the mRNA vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, the fourth dose doesn't take the antibody levels to a new high. A fourth dose just takes it back up to what it was when you got the third dose. So it's just a temporary benefit that you get from a fourth dose. But a third dose seems to be really valuable across the board for most of the vaccines.
There are two very important things that are in your answer, and may I pick them out? One, that the waning of the antibody levels after Covishield is probably faster than it is after Pfizer. And anyway, the level of antibodies that were reached after the second jab was to start with lower with Covishield than it was with Pfizer. So not only is the waning faster, but the point from which it wanes is lower than it is in the case of Pfizer. That's the first point, and therefore the gap should be, if it's Covishield you're talking about, for sure no more than 4 or 5 months. In India at the moment officially it's 9 months, so that is quite clearly too long if you're guarding against the possibility of BA.4 BA.5. BA.4 BA.5 haven't come to India, but you don't know when they'll come, and if they do, people will be caught with their, forgive me using a colloquial phrase, with their pants down, because their immunity levels will have fallen. The gap of 9 months is too long. That's the first critical thing. The second critical thing is that the newspapers in India are reporting that people seem to be fairly reluctant to take their third jab, even though it's been made available to everyone. And in some states, it's been made available free. And the reason is that people have got a sort of false confidence that because the number of cases have come down, the danger is past. You're pointing out that God forbid BA.4 and 5 should come to India, and you haven't taken your third jab, and you're more than 5 months or 6 months away from your second, you could be in danger of getting infected and falling in. Both of those follow, don't they?
Yes, I think your logic is sound. I think that what would be important is for India to look at its own data, to look at what antibody levels are doing in those who received Covishield. And if they are showing similar patterns to what we've seen elsewhere, then an interval that was closer to 6 months. And in the US, it's 4 months. In South Africa, right now, we're giving it at 6 months. So between 4 and 6 months is a reasonable interval before the third dose. Now, the third dose is because it's proving to be quite beneficial, especially against Omicron, that it becomes important to make sure people take their third dose. It's almost like, with many vaccines that we give 3 doses. If you take hepatitis B vaccine, we give you 3 doses. You take polio vaccine, we give you 3 doses. So, with COVID, it seems that 3 doses give you that maximum high of your antibody levels. But those antibody levels we know wane. And so there is only a limited benefit to getting that third dose. But that benefit, especially in the midst of Omicron, is an important benefit. So yes, if I follow what you've articulated, India should be contemplating giving out its third dose at a shorter interval, not just in anticipation of BA.4 and BA.5, but just because it needs as many people to have a third dose for their maximum protection.
I thank you for this interview, Professor Abdool Karim. In simple layman's language for the audience listening, I would say two things. One, if you're entitled to your third dose and you haven't had it, go get it, because if BA.4 and 5 come to India, it's your best protection against falling ill. And to the government, I would say, if you want to ensure that only a very small number fall ill if BA.4 and 5 come, shorten the gap from 9 months to something closer to 5 or 6. Given that we have enough vaccines in the country, we are, after all, the world's biggest maker of vaccines, there should be no problem doing this. I thank you for this interview, Professor Abdool Karim. You've been literally like a brilliant school teacher who's taught us and made it all seem so easy. That is the great credit you deserve for making it simple and easy for people like us who are laymen. Take care, stay safe.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.